Hello everyone, I'm Leela and welcome to today's DebtCircle Sundown brief for the 7th of July 2026. Let's begin with the top 5 highest yield listed corporate bonds. Topaz 04 2026 recorded a yield of 19.72% with a trade value of 150.00 lakhs. Monedo Financial Services Private Limited recorded a yield of 17.00% with a trade value of 50.00 lakhs. RDC Concrete India Limited recorded a yield of 16.5073% with a trade value of 1.00 lakh. Best Capital Services Limited recorded a yield of 15.96% with a trade value of 3.50 lakhs. Akara Capital Advisors Private Limited recorded a yield of 15.86% with a trade value of 65.00 lakhs. Now, moving to the top 5 highest yield unlisted corporate bonds. Apex Homes Private Limited recorded a yield of 14.00% with a trade value of 4,192.07 lakhs. CR Capital Private Limited recorded a yield of 12.00% with a trade value of 75.00 lakhs. Nuvama Wealth Finance Limited recorded a yield of 9.00% with a trade value of 40.00 lakhs. Another issuance from Nuvama Wealth Finance Limited recorded a yield of 9.00% with a trade value of 50.00 lakhs. A third issuance from Nuvama Wealth Finance Limited recorded a yield of 9.00% with a trade value of 30.00 lakhs. Let's look at mutual fund debt transactions. Gross purchases stood at 16,114.70 crore. Gross sales stood at 26,481.28 crore. Net investment stood at negative 10,366.58 crore. Net investment for July, month to date, stood at 1,401.270 crore. Now, here's the Foreign Portfolio Investor or FPI Debt Market Investment Update. Under gross purchases, the general limit recorded 1,402.69 crore. The Voluntary Retention Route or VRR recorded 305.97 crore. The Fully Accessible Route or FAR recorded 1,077.55 crore. Under gross sales, the general limit stood at 1,298.22 crore. VRR stood at 135.83 crore. FAR stood at 287.32 crore. Net investment under the general limit was 104.47 crore. VRR recorded 170.14 crore. FAR recorded 790.23 crore. For July, month to date, net investment under the general limit stood at 3,302.10 crore. VRR recorded negative 905.92 crore. FAR recorded 4,068.42 crore. For the calendar year 2026, year to date, the general limit recorded 30,527 crore. VRR recorded negative 612 crore. FAR recorded 40,333 crore. Now, let's take a look at the money market rates. The call rate stood at 5.25%. The T-repo rate stood at 5.14%. The basket repo rate stood at 5.21%. The special repo rate stood at 5.12%. Moving on to India government bond yields. The one-year government bond yield stood at 5.79%. The three-year yield stood at 6.18%. The five-year yield stood at 6.38%. The seven-year yield stood at 6.58%. The nine-year yield stood at 6.73%. The 10-year yield stood at 6.70%. The 15-year yield stood at 6.93%. The 30-year yield stood at 7.32%. Now for the Treasury bill yields and auction cutoffs. The 91-day Treasury bill yield stood at 5.25%. The 182-day Treasury bill yield stood at 5.47%. The 364-day Treasury bill yield stood at 5.66%. Let's move to liquidity indicators. Net liquidity injected stood at negative 129,188 crore. The Standing Deposit Facility or SDF stood at 149,525 crore. The marginal standing facility, or MSF, stood at 5,737 crore. Now, the MIBOR OIS rates. The 1-year rate stood at 5.73%. The 2-year rate stood at 5.87%. The 3-year rate stood at 5.96%. The 5-year rate stood at 6.12%. Modified MIFOR rates were as follows. The 2-year rate stood at 6.76%. The 3-year rate stood at 6.77%. The 4-year rate stood at 6.90%. The 5-year rate stood at 6.99%. Let's look at the currency market. The US dollar against the Indian rupee closed at 94.94, compared with the previous value of 95.43. The euro against the Indian rupee closed at 108.56, compared with the previous value of 108.93. The British pound against the Indian rupee closed at 127.11, compared with the previous value of 127.35. The Japanese yen against the Indian rupee closed at 0.59, unchanged from the previous value of 0.59. The Chinese yuan against the Indian rupee closed at 14.02, compared with the previous value of 14.06. Now, commodities and market indices. Gold, 24 carat with 99.9% purity, was at 14,526 rupees per 10 grams, compared with the previous value of 14,662 rupees per 10 grams. Silver stood at 2,450 rupees per 10 grams, unchanged from the previous value of 2,450 rupees per 10 grams. Crude oil stood at $72.60 US, compared with the previous value of $72.25 US. The Sensex closed at 78,180.72, compared with the previous close of 78,285.07. The Nifty closed at 24,398.70, compared with the previous close of 24,430.35. Finally, here's the India primary issuance update for corporate bonds. Kotak Mahindra Prime Limited issued 250 crore with a tenure of 38 months and a coupon of 7.97%. Aditya Birla Capital Limited issued 557 crore with a tenure of 118 months and a coupon of 8.07%. Bajaj Finance Limited issued 5,305 crore with a tenure ranging from 39 months to 121 months across multiple tranches, with coupon rates ranging from 7.70% to 7.79%. The issue carries AAA ratings from CRISIL Ratings Limited and ICRA Limited. National Bank for Agriculture and Rural Development issued 8,000 crore with a tenure of 42 months and a coupon of 7.16%. The issue carries AAA ratings from ICRA Limited and India Rating and Research Private Limited. Hinduja Leyland Finance Limited issued 30 crore with a tenure of 108 months and a coupon of 9.00%. That concludes today's DebtCircle Sundown brief for the 7th of July 2026. Thank you for watching. I'm Leela, and I'll see you again with the next market update.